Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place where we take a whole stack of sources, really dig in, and try to pull out the key insights for you.
Yeah, and today we're tackling something I think is really fascinating. It's this deep connection between your personality, who you fundamentally are, how you deal with stress, and, well, your overall health and well-being.
It's a big topic. We've got a pile of articles, research, all sorts of stuff here.
Exactly. And our mission really is to unpack all of it, find those crucial bits of information, and help you understand how these like enduring patterns in your thoughts, your emotions, your behaviors,
Yeah.
how they might actually shape your stress response.
And ultimately, your health outcomes, right?
Right. It makes you wonder, could who you are deep down actually make you more or maybe less susceptible to the effects of stress? Could it even, influence how long you live?
That's the core question. Let's dive in.
Okay, so to start making sense of this, scientists have come up with different models or frameworks to explain these links,
Ways of looking at it.
pretty much. The first one is often called the biological predisposition model.
Okay.
This idea basically suggests that it's your underlying biology, maybe genetics, maybe just how your nervous system is generally set up that really dictates how you react to stress.
So personality doesn't cause the health issues in this view.
Not directly, no.
Yeah.
In this model, personality is seen more as a reflection of that underlying biology. It's like your biological vulnerabilities make you more prone to health problems under stress, and your personality traits are just outward signs of that biological reality. They don't play a causal role themselves, according to this specific model.
Interesting. So personality is like a symptom almost. What's another perspective?
Well, then there are the health-related behavior models. These probably feel a bit more intuitive for most people.
Okay.
They focus on how your personality traits influence the kinds of behaviors you actually do that relate to your health. The good stuff and the bad stuff.
Right, like whether you exercise or smoke.
Exactly. And these models argue that it's those behaviors, which are often tied to how you cope with stress or just your general approach to life, that then have direct consequences for your health down the road.
Makes sense. Do the sources give examples?
Yeah, they mention how certain big five traits like being high in extroversion, agreeableness, and especially conscientiousness tend to be linked with more health protective behaviors. Think exercise, healthy eating.
The stuff we know we should do.
Right. But then interestingly, high openness sometimes gets linked to health-harming behaviors, like maybe substance use in some contexts. The sources really emphasize conscientiousness, though. The correlations there with health behaviors can be pretty substantial, like explaining up to maybe 29% of the difference between people.
Wow, okay, so personality shapes actions. Actions shape health. Got it. What's the third model?
The third one is called the moderation model. Here, personality acts more like an intervening variable. It sits between the stress and the health outcome.
How does that work? Like a filter?
Sort of, yeah. It influences how you appraise a stressful situation. Do you see it as a huge threat or something you can handle? And it influences how you cope. These internal processes, appraisal and coping, then shape your actual response, physiologically, emotionally, behaviorally.
And that determines whether you get sick or stay healthy.
It increases or decreases your susceptibility, exactly. It acts like a buffer against stress, or sometimes it can actually intensify the stress response.
And this plays out in our relationships too, right? The sources mention that.
Absolutely. They talk about a transactive process. Your personality can sort of set you up to either make interpersonal stress worse or better in this kind of back and forth way.
Oh, like that Claudia and Alicia example they used.
Precisely. Claudia, who's described as high in neuroticism and low in agreeableness, well, she tends to find herself in more conflicts and has less social support, especially when stressed.
Because of how she reacts, like when Alicia forgot that important thing.
Yes. That relatively small event, Alicia forgetting something, turned into a massive stressor for Claudia. Her personality traits, low in agreeableness, high neuroticism, led her to appraise it really negatively, like a personal attack.
Instead of just a mistake.
Right. And then her coping. She ruminated, sent a cutting email, withdrew, which just prolonged her own stress and actively damaged her relationship with Alicia, pushing away potential support.
Whereas Alicia, with a different profile, more extroverted, less neurotic, more agreeable and conscientious.
Exactly. Alicia would likely appraise that same situation very differently and cope in a way that doesn't escalate conflict, preserving her social ties and leading to a much less stressful outcome for her.
Okay, so let's quickly recap the models. Biological personality reflects biology, no direct cause. Health, behavior, personality, behavior's health. Moderation, personality filters or amps up the stress response itself.
That's a good summary. So with those ideas on the table, let's maybe clarify what we even mean by personality.
Good idea. What's the basic definition?
At its core, it's seen as the overall kind of enduring pattern of thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that defines you as an individual, makes you distinct.
Is that different from temperament? I've heard that term too.
Yeah, temperament is usually considered the more biologically based foundation. Think emotional reactivity, activity level, sociability, things you often see really early in infancy. Personality traits are seen as developing from that foundation, becoming these more stable, characteristic ways of thinking, feeling, and acting.
And traits are different from states.
Right. Traits are the enduring tendencies, the predispositions. States are temporary, how you feel or act right now. So using Claudia again, her trait neuroticism is her general tendency towards anxiety and distress. But her feeling angry and frustrated when Alicia forgot the appointment, that was an emotional state.
Okay, enduring trait versus fleeting state. Makes sense. The sources mention some key figures historically, Allport and Cattell.
Yeah, Gordon Allport was really central in developing trait theory, emphasizing these consistent patterns. And Raymond Cattell used statistical methods, factor analysis, to try and identify the underlying dimensions, famously proposing 16 personality factors.
And building on that work came Eysenck.
Right, Hans Eysenck. He focused on what he saw as 3 major independent dimensions, or supertraits. His PE model.
PEN, what does that stand for?
P is for psychoticism. Now, the name is a bit unfortunate. It doesn't necessarily mean psychosis in the clinical sense. It was more about traits like nonconformity, being tough-minded, maybe impulsive or cold, but also potentially creative. It's honestly less used in current research compared to the other two.
Okay, what are E and N?
E is the classic extroversion-introversion. Extroverts, sociable, lively, assertive, sensation-seeking. Introverts, more reserved, quiet, less driven by external stimulation.
And Eysenck had a biological theory for that, right? About stimulation levels.
He did. He hypothesized that introverts have a naturally higher level of cortical arousal via the ascending reticular activating system, or ARS. So they need less external stimulation to reach an optimal level, while extroverts need more.
Is there evidence for that?
There's some modest evidence. Studies looking at things like physiological responses, the famous lemon drop test measuring saliva, pupil responses, brain waves, do suggest introverts might be a bit more sensitive or reactive, especially maybe in the morning. Their threshold for stimulation seems lower.
Interesting. And the N in PEN?
Neuroticism. This dimension captures a tendency toward experiencing negative emotions. Think anxiety, depression, tension, moodiness, general emotional instability. High neuroticism means you're likely to feel bad more often and more intensely, particularly when stressed.
Okay, that sounds like a key one for stress vulnerability.
Absolutely. And this ties into another important biological model from Jeffrey Gray, his reinforcement sensitivity theory, which kind of builds on Eysenck. Gray proposed 2 core motivational systems in the brain. First, the behavioral approach system, or BAS. Think of it as the go for it system. It's sensitive to rewards and cues of reward fueled by dopamine pathways.
So it drives you towards good things.
Exactly. High BA sensitivity means you get a bigger kick out of potential rewards, you feel more happiness, more approach motivation. It's strongly linked to extroversion and positive well-being. Low BAS, conversely, is linked to things like depression.
Okay, and the other system?
The behavioral inhibition system, or BIS, this is the watch out or stop system. It's sensitive to punishment, non-reward, novelty, potential threats. It's linked to norepinephrine systems and promotes avoidance or inhibition of behavior.
So a sensitive BIS makes you more anxious.
Precisely. High BIS sensitivity means you have an exaggerated negative reaction. Anxiety, fear, worry when faced with potential negative outcomes. And this system is strongly linked to neuroticism and that tendency towards negative effect.
So Eysenck and Gray both point to biology underpinning neuroticism.
Yes, particularly the idea of an overreactive limbic system, maybe the amygdala especially, for those high in neuroticism. This could lead to being constantly more vigilant for threats, having a lower tolerance for stress, and just experiencing negative events more intensely. And the evidence for this kind of biological underpinning is definitely mounting.
Wow. Okay, so these models set the stage for the dominant model today, right? The big 5.
Exactly. The 5-factor model, or FFM, it's the most widely accepted framework now, proposing these 5 broad, relatively independent dimensions that capture most of the important variation in personality.
Let's list them. N is for
Neuroticism, like we've discussed. Extroversion.
Yo.
Openness to experience things like curiosity, imagination, liking novelty. Conscientiousness, being organized, diligent, reliable, self-disciplined,
And A,
agreeableness being cooperative, trusting, kind, sympathetic.
optionally. So the acronym, right?
That's the one. And it's important to remember these are broad dimensions. Most measures, like the well-known NEO-PI, also break each Big Five trait down into more specific facets.
Like extroversion isn't just one thing.
Right. It includes facets like warmth, gregariousness, assertiveness, activity level, excitement-seeking, positive emotions. Neuroticism includes anxiety, hostility, depression, self-consciousness, impulsiveness, vulnerability to stress. Looking at these facets gives a much richer picture.
Okay, so we have these models linking personality, stress, and health, and we have the big five as the main way to describe personality. Let's connect them. Which traits really stand out as vulnerability factors for stress and health problems?
Based on everything we've looked at, if you had to pick one factor that carries the highest risk, it's almost certainly neuroticism.
We keep coming back to that one. The sources mention the old idea of psychosomatic medicine, Freud linking conflict to physical symptoms. Is modern neuroticism related to that?
It's important to distinguish. The old psychoanalytic concept of neurosis isn't quite the same as the modern trait of neuroticism measured by questionnaires like the NEO-PI. But the underlying idea that this pattern of negative emotionality, anxiety, and distress has real consequences for physical health. That idea is very much supported by current research.
And the consequences are pretty significant.
They really are. The sources cite major reviews concluding that high neuroticism is consistently, robustly associated with lives that are, frankly, shorter, less happy, less healthy, and often less successful by conventional measures.
Why? What's the mechanism? How does being prone to feeling bad translate into those outcomes?
A really helpful way to understand this, mentioned in the sources, is the neurotic cascade model. It outlines 5 interconnected processes that kind of feed on each other, leading to more frequent and intense negative feelings for someone high in neuroticism.
Okay, break it down. What's the first step?
First is hyperreactivity. This goes back to the biology. They seem biologically wired, maybe through that sensitive BIS we talked about, to react more strongly with more negative emotion to stressors, even minor ones.
So a bigger initial reaction.
Exactly. Second, differential exposure. They actually tend to encounter or even create more hassles and negative events in their lives, especially in their social interactions.
Wait, they create more stress for themselves.
In a way, yes. Think back to Claudia. Her reaction to Alicia's forgetfulness wasn't just a reaction. It actively created conflict and stress where there might not have been any. So they end up experiencing more objective stressors.
Okay, so more reactivity and more exposure. What's third?
Differential appraisal. They're more likely to interpret situations, even ambiguous or neutral ones, in a negative light. They see threats where others don't. That's high primary appraisal. And they often doubt their ability to cope effectively. Low secondary appraisal.
Like Claudia assuming Alicia's forgetfulness must be a personal slight.
Precisely. Fourth is mood spillover. Negative emotions don't just happen and then disappear. People high in neuroticism tend to ruminate. They replay events, stew on them, keeping those negative feelings going long after the initial event is over. Recovery is slower.
So Claudia fuming for hours afterwards?
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And fifth, the sting of familiar problems. They often get stuck using the same, often ineffective coping strategies, maybe due to a lack of psychological flexibility or impaired decision-making when distressed. They keep trying the same flawed solution, like a fly banging against a window pane.
And seeing the same bad outcome just reinforces their negative view.
Exactly. It validates feelings of helplessness or pessimism. And the research supports this meta-analyses find high neuroticism linked to using more disengagement coping like wishful thinking or avoidance, and even turning to substances like drugs or alcohol, which obviously have long-term costs.
Wow, that cascade paints a really clear, if concerning, picture. How does this play out in terms of overall well-being and mental health?
The links are incredibly strong. Meta-analyses show neuroticism is robustly negatively correlated with subjective well-being. Things like happiness, life satisfaction, positive affect. It's probably the single strongest personality predictor of low well-being.
And mental disorders.
A major risk factor. It's strongly associated with symptoms of both depression and anxiety. The correlations are really high. It predisposes people towards what are called internalizing disorders, mood, and anxiety problems, as opposed to externalizing disorders like substance abuse or antisocial behavior, which tend to have a different big five profile, often lower end.
What about relationships? You mentioned Claudia pushing Alicia away.
Yes, it's consistently implicated in lower relationship satisfaction. Research suggests it's often the most significant big five predictor of dissatisfaction in intimate partnerships. The sources speculate this might stem from tendencies towards criticism, defensiveness, or just general negativity within the relationship. Studies of distressed couples frequently find a pattern involving high neuroticism.
Okay, so clearly linked to lower well-being, mental health issues, relationship problems. What about actual physical health and longevity? Is the evidence strong there?
This is where it gets slightly more complicated. Many large studies do find a link between high neuroticism and a greater risk of dying earlier, particularly from cardiovascular disease.
So there is evidence.
Oh, yes. One UK study, for example, found each standard deviation increase in neuroticism was linked to about a 10% greater risk of death from heart disease, even after controlling for other factors. Another big U.S. study found people in the top 10% for neuroticism had a 33% higher risk of death from all causes compared to the bottom 10%.
That sounds pretty convincing. Why do you say it's complicated?
Because not all studies find this. A decent chunk of research finds no relationship. And sometimes, particularly in studies of older, perhaps already frail adults, neuroticism has even appeared slightly protective.
Protective. How could that be?
It's unclear. Maybe being more vigilant or anxious leads to seeking medical care sooner in some situations. Or maybe it's just methodological differences how neuroticism was measured, the specific population studied. It just means the link to mortality isn't quite as universally consistent as the links to well-being or mental health.
Okay. But even if the mortality link is mixed, what are the plausible ways neuroticism could harm physical health?
Several pathways. One is that heightened physiological reactivity constantly triggering the sympathetic nervous system stress response, even for small things. Over time, that wear and tear could contribute to disease.
The biological cost.
Exactly. Then there are the behavioral pathways we discussed, the higher likelihood of engaging in unhealthy coping like substance use, maybe poor diet, lack of exercise. And there's even some link, though smaller, to things like occupational accidents.
So, summing up neuroticism, a major driver of negative feelings, lower well-being, relationship issues, mental health problems, especially internalizing ones, linked to unhealthy coping, possibly occupational accidents, and likely, though with some inconsistency in the research, an increased risk for physical illness and earlier death.
That captures it well. But it's important to end the neuroticism section on the optimistic note the sources provide. Research on lifespan development actually shows that emotional stability, the opposite of neuroticism, tends to increase for most people as they age, right up until late adulthood.
So people tend to mellow out.
It seems so. The general trend is towards becoming less neurotic over time, which is good news, suggesting that while it's a stable trait, it's not necessarily fixed in stone,
Yeah.
and its negative impact might lessen for many people naturally.
That is good news. Okay, let's shift gears. Another personality pattern that got a lot of attention regarding health was the type A behavior pattern.
Ah, yes, the classic hurry sickness. This came out of observations by cardiologists back in the 50s and 60s. They noticed certain patients seemed really driven, competitive, impatient, always racing against the clock. They labeled them type A.
And type B were the more relaxed ones.
Exactly. And the initial research was pretty groundbreaking. A large study, the Western Collaborative Group Study, famously found that men classified as type A were about twice as likely to develop coronary heart disease over the follow-up period, even when accounting for traditional risk factors like smoking or cholesterol.
Wow. So personality became a medical risk factor.
It really put personality on the map in medicine, and other early studies seem to support this link. But,
There's always a but.
right, by the 1980s, things started to unravel a bit. Larger clinical trials like the huge MRFIT study failed to find that same link between the overall type A pattern and heart disease risk. Meta-analyses pooling studies showed a pretty weak near-zero effect for the global type A construct.
So the whole type A thing was maybe too broad.
That became the thinking. Researchers started digging deeper, looking for the specific component within type A that might be the real problem, the toxic core.
And what did they find?
The focus really shifted towards hostility and anger. Studies using scales designed specifically to measure hostility, which is more like a cynical, mistrustful attitude, found that was a much better predictor of things like coronary artery disease progression than the broader type A pattern.
So it wasn't the impatience or competitiveness necessarily, but the cynicism and anger.
That seemed to be the key. One big study found that men scoring in the top 20% on hostility had a 42% greater risk of death over the study period, compared to those in the bottom 20%.
Why would hostility be so bad for the heart? What's the mechanism?
One leading idea involves inflammation. Hostility has been linked to higher levels of pro-inflammatory markers in the body, things like cytokines, which are known to play a role in the development of atherosclerosis, the hardening of the arteries.
And how you express anger matters too.
Definitely. The research suggests different styles have different outcomes. Consistently suppressing anger, keeping it all bottled up, often called anger in, seems particularly detrimental, linked to worse outcomes like more frequent angina or heart attacks. Expressing anger moderately seems healthier than either extreme suppression or constant outbursts.
It feels like there are nuances here. Hostility as an attitude, anger as a feeling, how you express it.
It does get complex, and the sources acknowledge that different studies measure these things slightly differently, which can lead to some inconsistencies. There's also overlap with neuroticism, depression, anxiety. But looking at the big picture, especially recent large meta-analyses,
What's the conclusion now?
the conclusion is that anger and hostility are indeed associated with an increased risk of developing heart disease in healthy people, and also with worse outcomes, like repeat heart attacks or death, in people who already have heart disease. It seems to accelerate the process.
Does this apply equally to men and women?
Interestingly, the link seems somewhat stronger and more consistent for men. Men, particularly those high in hostility or certain anger traits, tend to show greater cardiovascular reactivity, bigger spikes in blood pressure and heart rate during stressful situations compared to women.
So for women, maybe something else is more critical.
It's possible. Some research suggests that anxiety might actually be a more potent personality-related predictor of heart disease, specifically in women, whereas hostility anger is more central for men.
What about specific ways of being angry, like blaming everyone else?
Yes, the sources mention that kind of destructive anger justification, constantly blaming others, feeling wronged, wanting vindication. That particular style seemed to increase heart disease risk for both men and women. There's also some early preliminary evidence suggesting that constructive anger expression might be protective for men, but maybe not women. Still needs more research.
Okay, so for type A, the broad label faded, but the hostility component, that cynical mistrust, and certain anger styles like suppressing it or destructively justifying it are more robust risk factors, especially, it seems, for men's cardiovascular health.
That's a fair summary.
Mm-hmm.
And this focus on negative emotion and social difficulty led researchers to propose yet another pattern, the type D personality.
Type D for distress.
Exactly. This isn't about impatience, but combines two different traits. High negative affectivity, which is very similar to neuroticism, feeling anxious, worried, gloomy, and high social inhibition, being reserved, inhibited in social interactions, feeling uncomfortable expressing emotions around others.
Kind of like an introverted neurotic, like Claudia again?
Yeah, that's a reasonable comparison. It was proposed specifically as a predictor of poor prognosis, worse outcomes among patients who already have heart disease. There's a scale, the DS-14 used to measure it.
But you sound a little skeptical. The sources were too.
Well, the sources point out a few criticisms. One is that type D seems to overlap quite a lot with risk factors we already know about: neuroticism, hostility, depression, anxiety.
Yeah.
Is it really adding something new?
Is it just old wine in a new bottle?
That's the question. Also, a lot of the supporting research comes from the group that originally developed the concept, and independent corroboration is still needed. Plus, critics argue that studies don't always properly test whether the combination or interaction of negative affectivity and social inhibition is uniquely predictive, beyond just the effects of each trait alone. It feels a bit like we've come full circle from the broad type A to this specific D combination.
Okay, so type B is out there, but maybe with a question mark still hanging over it. We've spent a lot of time on the vulnerabilities. Let's flip the coin. What traits protect us? What makes people resilient to stress and healthier?
If neuroticism is the main villain in this story, then conscientiousness emerges as a major hero.
Right, the sea and ocean. Remind us what that involves.
These are the folks who are organized, reliable, hardworking, self-disciplined, responsible. They follow through on things. They plan ahead. They have good impulse control. Think Alicia from that earlier example.
It just sounds healthier, doesn't it? Being organized and responsible.
It really does, and the data backs it up strongly. High conscientiousness is linked to a whole host of positive things.
Yeah.
Less negative emotion, more positive emotion, higher well-being, lower risk of basically all mental disorders, Less substance use, fewer accidents, more satisfying relationships, better academic and job performance.
But specifically for physical health and living longer.
That's where it really shines, especially in research over the last couple decades. It's a powerful predictor.
How powerful? Are there key studies?
One of the most compelling is the term and life cycle study. It followed gifted kids from the 1920s throughout their lives. When researchers later analyzed their childhood personality ratings, the only trait that strongly and consistently predicted longevity, who lived into old age, was conscientiousness, specifically a facet related to social dependability and responsibility.
From childhood.
Yes, those who were in the bottom quarter for conscientiousness as kids had about a 35% greater risk of dying before age 70 compared to those in the top quarter. Notably, childhood sociability, which is related to extroversion, was not linked to living longer in that particular study.
Wow. Why? Why is being conscientious so protective? Is it just about healthy habits?
That's definitely a huge part of it. Highly conscientious people are simply much more likely to engage in health protective behaviors, exercising, eating well, not smoking, adhering to medical advice, and much less likely to engage in risky or unhealthy behaviors like substance abuse, risky driving, violence. Meta-analyses confirm this strong link, particularly the link between high conscientiousness and avoiding negative health behaviors.
Does that explain the entire longevity effect, just the behaviors?
Probably not entirely. While behaviors are key, large meta-analyses looking across many studies and countries find that the link between conscientiousness and longer life often remains significant, even after researchers statistically control for known health behaviors.
Suggesting there's something else going on.
Exactly. It could involve other pathways. Maybe conscientious people appraise stress differently, or they're better at regulating their physiological responses. Maybe it relates to biological factors we don't fully understand yet.
The sources mentioned a link to mindfulness.
Yes, that's an interesting connection. Research shows that among the big five, conscientiousness has the strongest positive correlation with mindfulness, while neuroticism has the strongest negative one. There's overlap in concepts like self-regulation and self-discipline. Being mindful might be one way conscientious people manage stress better.
And wasn't there a study on HIV patients?
Right, that was striking. It found that higher conscientiousness predicted better immune function specifically, increases in CD4 cell counts, and decreases in viral load over a year in people living with HIV. And this was even after accounting for factors like medication adherence.
So it wasn't just that they were better at taking their pills.
Exactly. It suggests conscientiousness might impact health through other routes, possibly by buffering the negative effects of stress on the immune system, maybe through better coping or lower activation of the stress axis. Follow-up research even suggested openness and extroversion might also relate to slower disease progression over longer periods in that context.
Okay, so conscientiousness, a really strong protector, linked to better health habits, avoiding risks, maybe better stress appraisal and regulation, potentially through things like mindfulness, and ultimately a longer, healthier life.
It's a very consistent and compelling finding.
What about extroversion? You mentioned it's linked to positive feelings.
Yes, extroversion is really the champion of positive affect and subjective well-being among the big five. Remember Gray's BA system. Extroverts seem to have a more active approach system, more sensitive to rewards, which fuels those feelings of happiness, enthusiasm, and general positivity. They might also be better at savoring good experiences.
Does feeling good translate to living longer?
That's where the evidence for extroversion is more mixed compared to conscientiousness. Some studies find a link between high extroversion and lower mortality risk, but others find no association, or even mixed results depending on the facet. So while it's strongly linked to feeling good, the direct link to lifespan isn't as clear-cut or consistent.
But are there other health-related benefits?
Oh, definitely. Socially, it's linked to greater relationship satisfaction, similar to agreeableness. Mentally, while it might increase risk for some externalizing issues, it seems protective against internalizing disorders like depression. And importantly, there's growing evidence linking extroversion to resilience and post-traumatic growth.
Growing from adversity, how does extroversion help there?
The idea is that their tendency towards positive emotions helps them broaden and build resources. They might build stronger social networks, be more flexible in their thinking, and physiologically recover faster from stress. It complements conscientiousness, which contributes to resilience more through persistence and effective problem solving.
Okay. What about the other two big five traits, openness and agreeableness? Any links to stress and health?
The research specifically on physical health and longevity for these two is much less extensive. For openness, some studies looking at specific facets like openness to feelings or actions have found links to better longevity in patients with heart disease, suggesting maybe emotional awareness or curiosity helps with flexible coping. But then again, other research, as we noted, sometimes links high openness to risk behaviors like substance use. So it's a bit nuanced.
And agreeableness.
Very few direct links to longevity found in studies, mostly non-significant results. Its main strength seems to be in the interpersonal domain. It's strongly linked to relationship satisfaction. Being cooperative and trusting is obviously a huge asset for navigating social stressors and maintaining support networks, which indirectly benefits health.
Okay, so beyond the big five, the sources talked about traits related to our sense of control. That seems important for stress.
Hugely important. A classic concept here is Julian Rotter's locus of control.
Internal versus external.
Exactly. Do you generally believe that you control what happens to you? That your actions lead to predictable outcomes? That's an internal locus of control like Alicia seemed to have. Or do you tend to believe that outcomes are determined by external forces, luck, fate, powerful others? That's an external locus of control, perhaps closer to Claudia's outlook.
And internal is generally better for health.
The evidence strongly points that way. That huge inner heart study across many countries found that having a strong sense of control was a significant protective factor against having heart attack. They estimated that maybe 16% of heart attacks could be attributed to having an external locus of control, assuming the link is causal.
Wow. Any other examples?
Yeah, another fascinating study tracked people from childhood. It found that kids who had a more internal locus of control at age 10 were significantly less likely to be overweight or obese at age 30, reported better overall health, and had less psychological distress, even after adjusting for things like childhood health and socioeconomic status. The impact was quite substantial.
So feeling like you're in the driver's seat really matters from early on.
It seems to. It's also linked to specific health behaviors. For instance, people with an internal locus are less likely to start smoking, and smokers with an external locus often find it harder to quit.
How can someone get a sense of their own locus of control?
Well, the scales ask questions designed to tap into this belief. You could sort of ask yourself similar things. When I made plans, am I pretty certain I can make them work? Or do I feel it's not much use planning too far ahead because too much depends on luck? Or do I believe getting a good job depends mainly on hard work? Or is it mostly about being in the right place at the right time? Reflecting on those kinds of questions might give you a sense of your general tendency.
Okay. Another control-related idea was hardiness.
Right. Developed by Suzanne Kobasa, hardiness is described as a sort of stress-resistant personality, characterized by what she called existential courage. It's seen as a combination of 3 C's.
The 3 C's.
Control, similar to internal locus of control, believing you can influence events. Challenge viewing stressful changes not as threats, but as opportunities for growth. And commitment, feeling deeply involved in your life, activities and values, having a sense of purpose. Hardy individuals are thought to use transformational coping, turning adversity into something positive.
Sounds great. Is the evidence strong?
It's mixed. There have been tons of studies, but the sources highlight some unresolved issues. A major one is the huge overlap between hardiness and low neuroticism. They're very highly negatively correlated.
Meaning hardy people are just not neurotic.
Largely, yes. And many studies that found positive effects for hardiness didn't properly control for neuroticism. When studies do control for it, the unique effects of hardiness often shrink or disappear entirely. So there's debate about whether it's truly a distinct protective factor or mostly just the absence of neurotic vulnerability. Also, much of the foundational work was done on men, and results for women have been less consistent.
Okay, so hardiness. Appealing idea, but maybe confounded with neuroticism. What about the third control concept, sense of coherence?
SOC, developed by Aaron Antonovsky. This is also framed as a global orientation that helps people cope with stress and stay healthy. It has 3 components, too.
More components, what are they?
Comprehensibility.
Yeah.
Feeling that the world around you and the things happening make cognitive sense. They're predictable and understandable. Manageability. Believing that you have the resources, internal or external, available to meet the demands you face. This is close to the control concepts.
Mm.
And meaningfulness. Seeing life's demands and challenges as worthy of your energy, engagement, and investment.
So life makes sense. I can handle it, and it's worth engaging with.
That's the essence of it. And the research on SOC looks quite promising. Reviews suggest it consistently promotes resilience and positive health outcomes, One large prospective study found that a higher SOC was linked to about a 10% reduction in death from all causes and an 11% reduction in cancer deaths, even when considered alongside other control measures.
So it might have direct biological benefits.
That's the implication, that having this strong sense that life is coherent might directly buffer the body's physiological stress response. It seems to be a robust protective factor.
Okay, looking back at these control constructs, internal locus of control seems clearly beneficial, linked to lower heart attack risk and better long-term health. Sense of coherence also looks very strong,
Mhm.
linked to lower overall mortality and maybe even cancer mortality. Hardiness is maybe a bit more questionable due to the neuroticism overlap.
That seems like a fair assessment based on the evidence presented in the sources.
Right. We have covered an incredible amount today. I mean, it's really clear that personality isn't just some abstract description of who you are. It's deeply tangled up with how you experience and navigate stress, and that has real, tangible consequences for your health and even how long you might live.
Absolutely. We've looked at how traits like high neuroticism, operating through that neurotic cascade, create significant vulnerability. We saw how the focus shifted from global type A to the more toxic core of hostility, particularly concerning for men's heart health. Maybe anxiety is key for women.
And then the flip side, the protective factors. Conscientiousness really stood out as a major health protector, linked strongly to longevity, probably through healthier behaviors, but maybe other pathways too.
Yeah, and while extroversion is great for happiness, its link to longevity is less consistent. But it does seem important for resilience. And we can't forget those powerful perceptions of control. Having an internal locus of control and a strong sense of coherence both seem really beneficial for navigating stress and promoting long-term health.
It really makes you think. So here's a final thought to leave you with, building on what we've discussed. We've heard that personality traits, while relatively stable, aren't completely fixed. Things like emotional stability can increase over the lifespan for many people. And we're learning more about how these traits link to coping and health. So, knowing all this, does understanding these deep connections between your fundamental patterns, your stress response, and your health, does that knowledge itself offer a potential lever for change? Can awareness empower you to perhaps consciously work on your coping strategies, modify behaviors, or shift perspectives in ways that could positively influence your health trajectory over the long run, even in the face of life's inevitable stresses? Something to ponder.